Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another edition of Mr. Merrigan's Moments in History, U.S. History Edition. So today, kind of continuing in this sort of theme we've been building, I'm going to create this video as kind of another support to help students as we kind of dive into some of these primary sources throughout U.S. history. And particularly, the sources we're going to look at today all center around this idea of the Sedition Act, which again sort of curtailed or sort of put some limits on freedom of speech during World War I and then the couple of years after World War I ends in the United States. And so we're kind of going to be diving into this idea of freedom of speech. Can it have its limits? Should it be limited during times of war? So we're going to be looking at a few different sources today to sort of dive into this idea of freedom of speech during times of war. So, as usual, we kind of have some questions to help guide us, and we've got a few sources. The first one's going to be from a speech from Eugene Debs, who's, again, a founding member of the American Socialist Party. But before we dive into his speech here, I want to kind of give you an idea of what we're going to be looking for as we listen. So, first thing we're always going to do is source. So, again, what type of document are we looking at? When was it written? And another really common thing we're going to look at today, especially with these first two sources, is author's claim in the document and then the evidence that they use to back it up. Another thing that we're going to see a lot of and we're going to kind of pull out of is tone. Word choice is going to be important today. What sort of words are they using to try to evoke emotion? What sort of emotion do you hear as you're reading their words? And certainly, what sort of choices are they making in their writing? And of course, we always want to keep in mind what's happening in both the United States and Europe at the time. So again, we're right here in the heart of World War I. And then with this one in particular, he's going to kind of talk a little bit and explore this idea of patriotism and sort of this idea between what's real patriotism, what's this fake bravado patriotism. And I want you to be thinking a little bit too about how his exploration, how it lines up with your definition. Sort of compare what you think the author's opinion of patriotism and your own are. So that's what I want you to be looking for. So again, we always start with sourcing, and again, the Digital Inquiry Group, formerly the Stanford Historical Education Group, does a great job of sort of condensing these. So if there are any teachers listening, highly recommend their sources. They're awesome. But again, they give us some vocabulary to look at, so we'll be sure to highlight those as we talk about them. But again, our source, this is a socialist leader, Eugene Debs. He's delivering a speech in June of 1918. So we're hearing this speech. They give us a little bit more background here at the top, so we'll take a look at that too. So Eugene V. Debs was a founding member of the Industrial Workers of the World. This is one of the, certainly kind of one of those first strong, powerful unions in the United States. He's also a U.S. presidential candidate of the Socialist Party of America and is one of the most famous American socialists in the early 1900s. And this is an excerpt from a speech he gave across the street from a jail where he had just visited 3 socialists who were in prison for opposing the draft. So in class we talked a little bit about the Selective Service Act. That's what created that draft. So Debs goes on to say, "Comrades, friends, and fellow workers, 3 of our most loyal comrades are paying the penalty for their devotion to the cause of the working class." Notice that choice and word devotion evokes some emotion. "They have come to realize, as many of us have, that it is extremely dangerous to exercise the constitutional right of freedom of speech." Okay, he doesn't just say he evokes the Constitution here. "In a country fighting to make democracy safe in the world. Every one of the aristocratic conspirators," so we got a couple of words here, so let's check down here. Aristocratic referring to upper class, conspirators meaning criminals. So again, powerful word choice there. "And would-be murderers," he's coming in hot, "claims to be an arch patriot." So again, a great patriot, like of the highest order. Think like if you've heard the term archangel, archangel. Every one of them insists that the war is being waged to make the world safe for democracy. What humbug, what rot, what false pretense. Again, pretense meaning an attempt to make something that it is not. These tyrants, boy, we are in some very hot language here. These red-handed robbers and murderers, again, he's trying to pull out emotion here. They say that they're the patriots, while the men who have the courage to stand face to face with them speak the truth and fight for their exploited victims. They are called the disloyalists and traitors. If this is true, I want to make my place side by side with the traitors in this fight. He who owns the earth and tells you that we are fighting this war to make the world safe for democracy. He who profiteers at the expense of the people who have been slain and mutilated by the thousands, again, slain means killed in battle in this case, under pretenses of being the great American patriot. It is the fact that the archenemy of the people. It is he that you need to wipe from power. It is he who is far greater menace to your liberty and your well-being than the Germans on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. So you heard a ton of tone in here, really trying to evoke emotion, using really powerful words, murderer, conspirators, and certainly tyrants. There's a lot of that language that gets pulled out that really gives you a sense of what Eugene Debs is trying to do with tone. The next one is from Charles Schenck. He ultimately is actually going to have his court case go all the way to the Supreme Court, where he's going to challenge the Sedition Act all the way to the top. But just to kind of give you a sense of what you're looking for here. Again, what kind of document we're looking at, we'll jump into that here in just a second. When was it written? Again, we're coming to that author's claim. What is that central message? And again, what evidence are they using to suggest it? Of course, we know context is important. Again, what's happening in the U.S.? Think Sedition Act, think Europe, World War I. Really pay attention here to word choice, how that impacts the tone. I think you're going to see some similarities between him and Debs. And then as an American citizen, do you think it is your responsibility to respond to the draft? In other words, if you were drafted, do you think it is your obligation as a citizen to uphold that call, to join the military, to go and fight? And then tell me why. Okay? I want to get you thinking about that. Try to put yourself in the shoes of the people living in the time period as best you can. So again, first thing we start with, we source. So we're looking from Assert Your Rights by Charles Schenck. This was from some pamphlets in 1917 through 1918. So it gives you a little bit more background here at the top too, so we'll take a look at that too. Charles Schenck was a socialist who in 1917 to 1918 printed and distributed more than 15,000 anti-war pamphlets, including some to drafted American men. The excerpt below comes from one of his pamphlets. Again, this comes from the one entitled Assert Your Rights. The Socialist Party says that any officers of the law entrusted with the administration of conscription, again, that's one of our vocab words, that's referring to the military draft, violate the provisions of the United States Constitution when they refuse to recognize your right to assert your opposition to the draft. To draw this country into the horrors of the present war in Europe, to force the youth of our land into the bloody trenches of war-crazy nations would be a crime the magnitude of which defies description. Magnitude in this case refers to the hugeness, the massiveness of it all. No spacious or plausible, in this case spacious means misleading, pleas about a war for democracy can cloud the issue. Democracy cannot be shot into a nation. It must be spontaneous. That means it must come kind of naturally. You can't force it. And purely from within. To advocate the persecution of another peoples through the fighting of a war is an insult to every good and wholesome American tradition. You are responsible. You must do your share to maintain, support, and uphold the rights of the people of this country. In this world crisis, where do you stand? Are you with the forces of liberty and light, or war and darkness? That last line especially lays it on heavy. He's evicting this idea of his mindset being that of liberty or your freedoms and light versus war and darkness to those who would uphold the Sedition Act. There's some heavy, heavy language in here again, too. Certainly pretty well on par with what we saw earlier here with Debs as well. The last one that I want you to take a look at is the Sedition Act itself. So with this one, essentially, when was it passed? Why did the government decide to pass it? And then I'm looking for you to be able to summarize it in your own words. What's the government trying to do with this law? And then, do you think this law was necessary? Tell me why. Tell me why not. And again, look to the law itself, or look to some of the examples as part of your evidence for your answer. So again, we always start by sourcing. This is the Sedition Act of 1918. It was passed by the United States Congress on May 16th of 1918. So again, we get a little bit more description here up at the top. This is an excerpt from the Sedition Act, signed into law by President Woodrow Wilson in 1918, shortly after Congress passed it in May of that year, along with the Espionage Act, which referred to punishment for spying. The law shrunk the rights of Americans. Wilson and the United States Congress claimed the dissent would harm America's effort to win the war. There's your why. Right in there. The idea that it would harm the war effort. And Congress repealed the act in December of 1920, 2 years after the end of the war. So again, upholding it through that time period afterwards too. So again, this is from the Sedition Act itself. Whoever, when the United States is at war, shall willfully utter, which means to say, write or publish any disloyal, profane, so in this case, this means disrespectful, scurrilous, which means insulting, or abusive language about the form of government of the United States, or the Constitution of the United States, or the military or naval forces of the United States, or the flag of the United States, or the uniform of the Army or Navy of the United States. So you got some pretty specific institutions. The idea of the republic, or elements of democracy with your form of government, the Constitution itself, the uniform, the symbol of the men and women serving in the Army and the Navy, the forces themselves, or the flag of the United States. So they go after symbols too, certainly in this. Or shall willfully utter, print, or write any language intended to incite, that means to stir up, provoke, or encourage resistance to the United States, shall be punished by a fine of not more than $10,000, or the imprisonment for not more than 20 years, or both. And so again, you can see at this point, that's a pretty stiff penalty for speaking out against your government, against the military, against the symbols of the country, or symbols of the military. So again, very much put in place here to minimize criticism of those institutions during the war. Now, you're not asked to dive into this one, but I just want to share this one. This one comes from when Charles Schenck is brought before, his court case is brought before the Supreme Court. And again, this excerpt comes from that case. It was a unanimous opinion here in Schenck versus the U.S. in 1919. And again, Supreme Court decision. This is from Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., given on March 3rd, 1919. It says, the opinion of Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. The character of every act depends upon the circumstances in which it's done. So, the context in which the language is used. The most stringent protection of freedom of speech would not protect a man in falsely shouting fire in a theater and causing a panic. So you may hear that whole idea of yelling fire in a theater. It comes from this case. The idea being that if you're in a movie theater or a theater watching a play and you yell fire, that's not going to, freedom of speech does not protect you in that case if somebody gets hurt or worse should happen and somebody should die in the panic that gets caused there. The question in every case is whether the words are used in such circumstances and are of such a nature as to create a clear and present danger that they will bring about the substantive evils that Congress has a right to prevent. When a nation is at war, many things that might be said in time of peace are such a hindrance to its effort that their utterance will not be endured so long as men fight, and that no court would regard them as protected by any constitutional right. So they very much side with the United States here in that your freedom of speech is not something guaranteed to you in times of war, particularly if it would hurt the war effort. So again, very much dials on the support of the Sedition Act. Now, we've certainly seen this get dialed back in more recent times of war, and certainly the freedom of the press certainly has been less challenged by the U.S. government in recent wars, specifically since World War II. And so that isn't to say that some things don't get censored. I would say since Vietnam, there's definitely been some bigger changes to this. That sort of opposition is more tolerated. And so for my students, I hope this helps you. I hope that you were kind of able, by hearing it and kind of listening to a little bit of the discussion here, able to pull out some of those things that I'm hoping that you kind of can pull out from today. For those of you who are just listening, thanks for listening. I appreciate it. I hope you learned something. And I'll see you next time on Mr. Merrigan's Moments in History.